by the way, just to make sure everybody know, Tim is actually an attendee, right? He's a member of our MN365 community and has been attending a lot of our sessions here over the last, what you say, last year or so, 2 years?
Yeah, I would say last couple years,
Okay.
every now and then. Minnesota's community has been the closest to where I work. I actually recently moved to Minnesota too, but my home office, remote office at this point, is in Des Moines, Iowa. So
Okay.
I'm one of those cross-staters who attend,
That's great.
learning stuff across state lines.
We appreciate that. So thanks for volunteering, Tim, and I'll let you do your session. Thank you.
All right. So I guess we'll start into almost everything to know about the Microsoft Teams Export API. About me, I've been a software developer since graduating Iowa State University. I transitioned into SharePoint 2007 and 2010. It's kind of one of those typical stories that you get asked to learn SharePoint, and then you kind of get stuck with it, throughout your career. But I mean, it's been a good space for me. I truly enjoy the environment of SharePoint, as it's evolved. And more recently, we went through our cloud transformation starting back in 2018. So we migrated, the company that I currently work for, we migrated to M365 Azure and AWS for our cloud services. So my background is primarily in the Microsoft workspace, or workspace area, and I just have loved it since I've gotten into it, ever since I've used Visual Studio, honestly. So quick outline about the presentation I'm going to be going through. The first item we're going to talk about is what drove me and my company to explore the Microsoft Teams API. We're going to talk about licensing and cost considerations, because with the APIs that I was using for this solution, there is a cost. There are some cases where you can use it to evaluate and explore, but then with licensing of additional products, you get some free calls kind of built in a monthly basis. Excuse me. Prerequisites for kind of setting up your own environment, doing an implementation of calling the export API. In particular, I'm going to be using PowerShell as my kind of demonstrating product. I won't be able to do any demos, but I will have some screenshots and kind of reference some commands inside of the Microsoft Graph PowerShell SDK, which, if you haven't used it yet, is a great product from Microsoft. I 100% recommend looking into it when you have some time. Then kind of last 2 pointers, monitoring how the Teams Export API is being used inside of the environment, and also subsequently monitoring the cost that it's incurring, and then kind of some of the future considerations for what I was able to look at from the perspective of Wellmark, and kind of some of the future considerations, for the API in general that I would think about. So, why did we end up using the Teams Chat Export API? Well, we have situations where we would like to write Teams chat and channel messages into a different system of record of, outside of M365, outside of Purview, inside of Microsoft. There is also within that external system the definitions to handle the appropriate the appropriate retention of messaging for our corporation's compliance and e-discovery purposes. So, once that goes away from M365 and from Purview, you kind of get a little bit more control over the data flow of what's going in and what's being kept and that kind of stuff, which can be really freeing as far as the administrative part of it goes. The first iteration that I was trying to think of was a really simple implementation. Just using the get API calls of the services underneath everything. To talk about some of those nice things that you potentially get from implementing, something like this inside of an external system. You're going to start to be able to limit more chat and channel data that's available within Teams. So that will lead to smaller scopes for search and, more importantly nowadays, your Copilot usage, so that you're going to have more up-to-date data and more relevant data available for your users and the prompts that they're using inside of Copilot and just within search in general. The last thing we were kind of hoped to see was to improve Teams' overall performance. Now, it's gotten a lot better, especially with Teams 2. But, it's a lot nicer not having to kind of have that range of scrolling off to the side with chat messages to kind of indefinitely scroll down and keep loading content. And, that kind of takes a toll on a system, honestly, as you're loading more and more of that stuff up. So next topic we're going to get into is the licensing model and the associated costs. Now, let's start with the free stuff. The evaluation model, mostly going to be for dev development kind of stuff and the API exploration in general. There's no prerequisite licensing associated with evaluation model whatsoever. But you only get 500 messages per month, per app, per tenant. So it's very limited, unfortunately, in its usage. And as you're kind of going through the API, you definitely have to be cognizant of how much data you're returning back. Now, after you use up those 500 messages, unfortunately, what will happen is that the graph will say, "Hey, you're out of capacity for using the evaluation model. So please set up either Model A or Model B." For charging back those API calls to your tenant. Model A is for security and compliance purposes. And what that requires is it requires active DLP licenses on your monitored users. So, those licenses could be for the breakout pieces of Purview, or they could be for the entire E5 M365 suite. So those, as long as those licenses are enabled on a user, you will get 1,600 messages per active DLP license per month per tenant. If you go over the messages limit, then it will cost a fraction of a cent. Less than even 1 cent in general, 0.00075 cents per message that you retrieve. Model B, compared to Model A, is for everything else. So if you're like exporting to exporting a Teams chat in general to maybe get some sentiment analysis, or run some analysis in general on the chat, or maybe just exporting the chat for users. This isn't something I've necessarily implemented yet, but this is something you probably look at if you wanted to utilize or create those functions for your users. There's no seeded API calls with this license, unfortunately. It's just straight pay per message retrieval at that point. But again, it's less than a cent. So you really have to accumulate a lot of messages to see those charges being applied to your Azure registration that I'll show you how to set up later in the slides. Now, I just wanted to go through a quick kind of calculation of Model A seeded messages. Again, per DLP, per active DLP license, and those can be on M365 E5s, A5s, G5s, E5 compliance, E5 information protection and governance. I grabbed that green text straight from a Microsoft documentation page. So, feel free to reference that to kind of see if your company qualifies for that in general. But say you had 3,000 users, multiply that times 1,600, and you would get 4.8 million messages that you would be able to pull down from the Teams export API via a GET call. So that can be a lot of messages in general. But it all depends on how heavily your corporation uses Microsoft Teams for communication and collaboration within itself. This was actually something I recently learned. There is a report in the Teams Admin Center that will give you some. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm confusing this with another slide later on in my presentation. This is actually telling you how you can estimate. Sorry. This is telling you how you can estimate how many messages you have inside of your tenant, kind of on a per month basis. So you visit your Teams Admin Center, you navigate to analytics reports and go into usage reports from the left-hand navigation. Then you select the report for Teams user activity, give it a date range between 7 and 180 days. If you select the 30-day aggregate, it will give you kind of your last month's worth-ish of Teams chat and channel message content. And then if you export 180 days to a CSV, you'll be able to kind of slice and dice and figure out, some trends as far as how many chat messages you might have kind of sitting in being held inside of Teams that you could export and access via the Teams export API. Now, there is another kind of monitoring report, and I'm sorry I confused this in my head speaking about this, but I'll get to that later in the presentation once I get to my section on monitoring. Okay, some prerequisites for setting this up and for kind of using the Teams export API. You'll want to work, if you're not already in contact with, at least, probably an Entra ID or Azure Active Directory administrator with enough permissions to set up with this setup. This is probably going to be a global administrator or a subscription administrator as well when I go through kind of the steps. Again, evaluation model, you can use that initially. That only requires the Entra ID application registration. But this is something you want to be careful with. It's very easy to fly through 500 messages from the Teams Export API perspective. Now, in addition to, you could probably look at setting up a temporary tenant to look at this kind of stuff. And if you do, then you're probably going to be able to fulfill all of these roles within that, testing tenant that you have set up. For Model A and B implementations, you're going to need that Entra ID application registration again. But in addition to that, you will need to run some scripts inside of Entra/Azure to enable the metered API calls to be assigned to a subscription and resource group so that Microsoft knows where to charge that portion of a cent when you go over, or when you go over your seeded calls, or if you just need to start using it from the Model B perspective. I'm personally using PowerShell 7 with the latest version of the Microsoft.graph PowerShell SDK. I think I am at like 7.4 something for PowerShell, and it's pretty easy to kind of get it going in general. But you can also use PowerShell 5 Plus with the SDK. But if you have the opportunity, definitely be using the latest and greatest of inside of PowerShell. Now, the last one is optional. Have Visual Studio Code maybe downloaded onto your client that you're going to be writing or testing these scripts in. It's something that, again, kind of I grew up with development-wise and career-wise. There are some specific setup pieces that you need to add in for Visual Studio Code to get it to kind of recognize PowerShell script development in general. I'm not going to go over that during this presentation, but I do have a good article referenced at the end of my presentation that can be used to kind of go through the steps of setting up Visual Studio Code. All right. Got to move my slides over to see what's coming up next. All right, let's start with the Entra ID application registration. What you're going to do using your tenant's normal credentials. This is something typically that isn't shut down by default for all tenants, but it can be. So your mileage might vary. You might have to, again, kind of get in contact with your Entra ID and Azure administrators to kind of get an understanding for what this process might look like within your tenant. But if you're doing it, again, from within a testing tenant in general, this is going to be found by going to the Entra ID portal. There's going to be a link inside of the M365 Admin Center with certain permission sets to get there. And this is me kind of following old habits, but I also still reference portal.azure.com and get access to those elements all within the Azure administrative portal. But what you're going to look for is you're going to go into Entra ID. You're going to look for the application's navigation element off to the left side. And then you're going to go under applications and you're going to click All Applications, and then go to there should be a button in there to create a new application registration. So from there, you're going to want to follow the prompts that Entra takes you through to create the application registration. You're going to give it a name, and you're going to have to fill out a few other fields within there that honestly are trivial. There's one that I believe that will ensure that it's limited for use inside of your tenant. So make sure you pay attention to what you're selecting in that prompt when you're going through the process. But the next step that is going to be a huge kind of thing during the setup of this will be adding the appropriate set of Microsoft Graph permissions for the app registration to be able to interact with the data inside of your tenant. So what you're going to look for in those API permissions in the application registrations is you're going to search for chat read all, user read all, groups read all, and then channel message read all. So the chat and the channel messages in particular, those API groups are concerned with reading through all of the messages within your tenant for chat and channel messages. Now, users and groups, users will enumerate, you will allow your application to enumerate and query all of the users inside of your tenant. Excuse me. And groups are related to M365 groups, which are going to be relating to back to your teams inside of your tenant. So you don't necessarily need these two, but if you're going to set it up in the way that I'm speaking towards, yeah, you definitely need user read all and groups read all in this situation. There are going to be application permissions in this kind of example way, and not the delegated permissions. Application permissions means that it will be able to run without an interactive user account in the end. But you know, this can also be set up in a delegated way, so that maybe if you're writing it for a per user function, you know, that could be considered in the implementation. All right. And the last thing, especially for these application permissions that you're requesting inside of the Graph API, you're going to need your global admin to approve the permissions. So this is something where you would probably just email them or do a screen share quick to let them know that you're setting up this application registration, you know, with these permissions, and what they will see when they go into this screen viewing the application registrations, they will see a button to consent for the organization. So once that consent is granted, you'll be able to kind of make these API calls to the Graph API backend. All right, so let's talk about the steps for kind of implementing this as far as chat goes. First, again, sorry, getting ahead of myself with some of these things. You're going to want to note the client ID of the application registration. Sorry. And in addition, with noting that client ID, you're going to have to either create a secret value but it's much more secure to create a self-signed certificate and export the private key to add it to that app registration. Sorry, I can't read my small slides, and I can't. I don't think I have instructions for this in this slide deck, but I do have a article to reference how to do this. But what you'll be able to do, kind of in the subsequent steps, you'll be able to call to connect to the Graph API using Microsoft PowerShell's Graph SDK, and you'll be able to use that client ID and then the thumbprint of the certificate that you set up. But that's coming up later. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm really kind of geeking out about presenting this. So, you know, after you have those two things, the client ID and your certificate set up, alternatively, you can use the application secret or the client secret piece of it, which ends up being just like a password for it, honestly. So anyway, you'll also want to kind of look at this step. If you are going to use Model A or B set up with this application registration, you'll need to work with that subscription admin to set up the connection for the app registration to be able to charge its extended service calls to a subscription. So this is something, again, follow your best practices within your corporation for that kind of setup in general. But in the end, what you're going to have probably your subscription admin and or maybe your global admin interact with. You're going to have them run this Azure CLI command, which this is the only way I've found documented so far how to do it. But it's a AZ Graph Services account create a resource group, yada yada yada. You're going to insert these values for the resource group, this MyGraph app billing, and the subscription GUID will probably come from your subscription admin. But this app ID, this is going to be that app registration GUID, the client ID that I mentioned in the previous step that you needed to make note of. In the case of the Model A setup, this will also, I believe, trigger some of the reports to be available inside of the Teams Admin Center when it starts seeing that Model A usage behavior in the background. Now, before I get into talking about the Microsoft.Graph PowerShell SDK, again, this is I use this on a regular basis in my roles. It implements and handles authentication and authorization. That's something that I don't typically like to write out myself. So it's really nice that you can kind of use the PowerShell SDK for Microsoft Graph to kind of concentrate on writing code as a solution versus, writing all of the little pieces for it. Authentication and authorization are kind of their own bear altogether. It's updated regularly, and in my use of the Microsoft Graph PowerShell SDK, their commandlets are implemented with an awesome debug mode. And inside of that debug mode, what it will do is actually it'll print out a large screen of details of what it's doing inside of that graph call. including kind of the the graph endpoints, the HTTP endpoints that it's hitting with the Microsoft Graph altogether. So I've found I've used a lot of the out of the box commandlets, but with some of the things expanding inside of the Graph API almost constantly. I've been finding myself doing most of my exploration using invoke MG graph request, which is just again kind of using this authentication authorization set up here and applying it to an API request that goes over standard or HTTP, S for secure. But it's something that it's easy to kind of hit an endpoint and tinker with it as I see the request going through. I can get an error. I can hit the up arrow inside of PowerShell as I'm exploring, or I can use Visual Studio to kind of step through the process and debug, my script that I'm writing. Okay. So let's talk about going into more in depth into the PowerShell module, the Microsoft Graph PowerShell module. It's pretty simple. Quickly, you can install it using install module, Microsoft.graph, scope current user. That'll actually download the PowerShell module and store it in a local area where you have write access. So you don't need administrative privileges to download and install the PowerShell Graph SDK, which is really nice. This is where it comes into the authentication and authorization kind of piece of it. This is also where you're going to use that application registration and self-signed certificate to connect to the Graph API. So you use the command connect mg Graph API, pass in your tenant ID, which is also honestly back inside of your application registration. There should be a little line inside of there that lists the tenant ID, the client ID, and then the certificate thumbprint for your self-signed certificate that will authenticate your system to the Graph API. Now, kind of doing some exploration inside of the API, you can use the get mg all user chat message top one. You can use your own personal user ID, and what you'll do to find this is you'll look through. There's actually a users area inside of Entra, and if you search for your name inside of the users, you should be able to pull up the properties of your user account, and inside of there will be a really long string of kind of I would say memorable, excuse me. You won't be able to remember all of the characters in the string, but you'll be able to copy and paste it. But that's what you'll probably be using here. I think there is currently a bug in this commandlet as I've been kind of testing this for this presentation. It retrieves a lot of messages, and when you're supposed to use top one, it's supposed to only bring back one. So if it's bringing back too much data, just kind of remember to yourself, if you hit Control-C within a PowerShell prompt, that will terminate the PowerShell script as it's running. Now, you can also, again, use my favorite and, a bit more potent example, the invoke MG graph request with the HTTP endpoint, graph.microsoft.com, inside of the user's namespace. Again, this is going to be your user GUID that you paste in there, and then you pass in the rest of the URL for chats, get all messages, and then the top one, which is a parameter here, becomes a request parameter at the end, and that is denoted by this question mark and dollar sign inside of the URL. And again, with both of these, I pass in debug as a parameter so that I can see kind of the steps that it's taking as it's making those calls. By default, if you do not pass in a model, it will use the evaluation model. So it'll charge those calls against those initial 500 messages that you get per month overall for kind of exploration and development purposes. If you do want to, go beyond those, that's where you have to get into the Model A or Model B scenario, and those are additional parameters for those graph scripts or the graph API call altogether. Now, there are other parameters with both of the commandlet and the API endpoint. For the API endpoint, these are kind of the standard OData pieces that you get out of the box: count, expand, filter, format, order by, search, select, skip, and top. And I've included a reference point from Microsoft's documentation for that inside of my PowerPoint presentation. Inside of PowerShell, however, there are two different parameters that get renamed. Expand becomes expand property, and order by is actually sort. So you got to kind of keep that in mind, that there may be some changes in command interpretation as you switch from a direct HTTP request versus using just the PowerShell commandlet. In particular, at some point, you're definitely going to want to explore the use of filters because that is going to be helpful for breaking down the information, which, I'll actually talk about that later in the presentation, because that's kind of a gotcha, especially when you consider the different pricing models in the back of your head. Here's a couple of screenshots from what the get MG all user chat message with debug mode looks like. Again, it's really nice that it tells you, hey, I'm doing this, and I'm doing this API call here. Also note that it tells you where it's kind of going to throughout the process. So absolute URI, here's the graph API call for the get all messages. Here's the this is the HTTP response. Sorry, I have to zoom in with my eyes onto my own slides. And then here's the entirety of the body, the JSON object that it returns from that API call. Now, you do lose a little bit of readability if you use the MG graph requests, but you kind of get a similar output behind the scenes. Again, it's telling you kind of what it's doing, and underneath everything, kind of the last result set that you see will be this straight HTTP response to kind of review. If you, use a variable and you set your API call, this invoke MG graph request to that variable, it'll give you an object back, which is really nice. So PowerShell will automatically take that response JSON and parse it into an object that you can use and explore from the command prompt or from within, your development environment that you're using. So that's really something I love about PowerShell in general. All right. So let's, let's now talk about kind of the logic steps that I did think about as I was implementing this whole setup. First, you want to retrieve a list of your users for exporting chat messages. And then what you're going to do is you're going to loop through that list of users. Again, going back, you use that user ID inside of the graph API calls and the get all messages method or commandlet to specify who you're getting the chat messages for. Now, for each of those messages, eventually you'll run some additional script or run some additional code to transform the message that gets returned into something else that you input to your system of record. And then after you do that transformation, then you send it to that system of record. And that's kind of the logic flow that I was thinking of as I was implementing, a prototype for this solution. So what that looks like, at least in PowerShell code and in, more or less a first draft format here, we've got our connect MG graph into the tenant ID using the client ID and the thumbprint. I'm retrieving to a variable all of the users in my tenant. And then I'm using a for each loop on each of the items in this collection of users to get one user at a time and then run the graph API call against that single user. Now this will get a list of messages. This will get multiple responses because I'm not sending in the oh, actually, you know what? Looking at my URL, I'm sorry, I didn't say this. I'm only going to get one response because I passed in top one for this example. But if I remove this top one from the request query string, then I would get multiple responses back. And most likely that would be something additional that you'd have to think about during the implementation of this is, I believe, no, I don't believe, Microsoft Graph will only send you back pages of results. So in addition to kind of iterating through individual messages, you'll also have to iterate through pages of messages. So, as you kind of experiment and explore, this will probably get more complicated as you kind of play around with things. Okay, so remember how I said there were some gotchas with this whole situation? Well, the export API will return both sent and received messages inside of the context, inside of the user context, and that's due to the way that the the chat messages are stored within Exchange Online. You know, if you didn't know this, there is a hidden folder within your Exchange profile that stores all of your team's interactions, chat messages in particular. You know, for the purposes of being able to scroll back through them and read them, and also for compliance and e-discovery purposes as well. So when you call like the API and you're looking for certain messages between like your user account and maybe some other person that you're testing with, it will return both your sent messages to that user and also the received messages from that user that you get from them. So let's say you sent them 100 messages. They sent you 100 messages as well. You're going to get charged for 200 API message calls in that scenario. So this is definitely something that you have to watch out for when you're developing or kind of looking at solutions for this. All of these calls to the API will bloat further when you consider not only one-to-one chat, but group chats, because group chats can be stored in multiple inboxes or multiple Exchange Online areas for different users, and it can get really large in that API message call tracking that Microsoft has. So just warning you, take it slow. Definitely, as you're exploring, use that top filter or the top parameter to kind of limit the results that you get from the Teams API, Teams Export API. Funny thing about this slide, this is off topic, but I learned PowerPoint Designer sometimes doesn't have designs that you like. So I wasn't able to apply a design to this slide. But anyway, for channel messages, it's kind of going to be a similar mindset, but where you're going to loop is you're going to kind of use that. You're going to use that API permission to read all of the groups within your tenant. Excuse me. You're going to retrieve a list of groups. You're going to filter out the groups that do not have a team, because why make the API call altogether if you know whether or not that M365 group has a team associated with it. So skip over the ones that you don't really want to do. And then from within that list of groups that have a Microsoft team associated with them, that's where you're going to use, again, the Graph API to get all of the channel messages for that team. Then you're going to transform the individual messages for that system of record that you're getting into. And then you're going to send that data into the system of record. Now, this is kind of a quick demonstration of what I was saying, that the Microsoft Graph API can change, or sorry, the Microsoft Graph PowerShell SDK can change a lot, kind of in between as you're doing different things. Currently, there isn't a commandlet for getting all of the Teams channel messages, and the only way to do that is to use invoke mggraph request. And again, that's against this endpoint under the Teams namespace. You pass in the team GUID, which is the group GUID, and go into channels and get all messages from there, and then pass in the top one. Okay, let's see. I'm running out of time. So again, I have some PowerShell code in here to kind of look through. I'm going to quickly swap over to my last few slides so we can go through the meeting survey and the last little bit that we have here. After a solution like this is implemented, that's the point where you would kind of cut back on your team's chat retention. Again, this is something where you can go back and set up. You're going to want to monitor it and figure out how you're going to go back and get some maybe of the older chat messages. But all things considered, you can be planful for that. And then lastly, if I had implemented a full solution for this, I'd look at Azure Functions and Azure Logic Apps for setting this up. But the rest of the user story, we ended up seeking out third-party solutions in parallel with this prototyping, because honestly, it's very complex to implement a solution, and long-term, we're probably going to save money going with a third-party solution in general. Okay, monitoring really quickly. In the Teams Admin Center for Model A, there is a report under Usage Report, and the report name is Information Protection License Report. Select the date and the application registration that you have set up. And what you'll be able to see is you'll be able to see your list of how many API calls that you have, how many API calls you have remaining, how many API calls you have used up. So that's really cool. Monitoring Model B, this is more rudimentary. You have to use the Azure Cost Report function to export those reports, and then subsequently those go into a storage account, and then you can access those CSVs from the storage account and then apply a filter to the meter subcategory to Teams Export API to kind of get a gauge for how many API calls that you're using. So these are two very important things that you want to keep an eye on as far as your Teams API export usage go. Again, I really want to call out, look at using filters for these API calls, because I believe that will let you reduce your usage of the Teams Graph API. There are recordings and transcripts that can be retrieved from the API. I haven't covered that yet because basically that was a new feature altogether as we were kind of doing things and implementing the original use case. Copilot chat interactions are currently in preview inside of the Teams Chat Export API. So if you need to be, exporting that data into an external system, look for that feature to be coming out pretty soon. I want to use this in the future. I want to try it out in Power Automate, use a customer connector, because I just like to prove out whether or not that would work. But other ad hoc business requests for non-security kind of business usage to analyze, what's going on inside of a chat. Maybe if you're using customer service somehow through Microsoft Teams, you'll be able to take that chat out to sentiment analysis and have them get the mood of your customers or something like that. And of course, external backup and restore capabilities. Anyway, thanks for letting me put on this presentation. Definitely check out the PowerShell Graph SDK, and this is I guess a reminder for other administrators out there. Excuse me. The MS Online module is end of life March 30th. So Microsoft Graph.entra is the replacement for that. So anyway, check it out. Start using the new namespace if you can. And thanks. I'll see if I can send these slides over so everyone can use these references if they need to. So, Don
Great.
or
Yeah.
Michelle?
Thank you, Tim. Any questions out there?